In Houston, the night had settled the way it always does in quiet neighborhoods across the city. Porch lights glowed softly. Cars sat parked and still. Inside homes, televisions murmured, phones were plugged into charge, and families prepared for sleep. There was nothing about this night that suggested danger. Nothing that hinted at the violence that was about to tear through one house and leave a permanent scar on the entire community. This was the kind of neighborhood where routine ruled, where doors were locked out of habit, not fear, where the idea of a violent intrusion felt distant, almost unreal. People believed that once they crossed the threshold of their homes, they were safe, that whatever chaos existed outside stayed there. That belief would be shattered in minutes. Sometime late that night, the calm was broken, not by shouting in the street, not by sirens in the distance, but by an intrusion so sudden and aggressive that there was no time to process what was happening. Armed individuals forced their way into a private home. What began as a home invasion escalated rapidly, spiraling into a violent confrontation that no one inside could have anticipated. Gunfire erupted. In a matter of moments, a place meant for rest and safety became a battlefield. The walls that once echoed with everyday life now absorbed the sound of chaos. Fear replaced familiarity. Survival replaced routine. And when the gunfire stopped, the damage was irreversible. This was not a simple burglary gone wrong. This was not a random smash and grab. What unfolded inside that Houston home was a violent encounter that ended with lives lost and questions that would linger long after the scene was cleared. A confrontation that forced everyone involved to face the thin, fragile line between security and vulnerability. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to real-life stories that go beyond headlines and police summaries, take a moment to subscribe to Real Crime Saga and turn on notifications. Here, we don't rush through tragedy. We take the time to understand what happened, why it happened, and how moments like these forever change the people and communities caught in their wake. Because what happened next didn't just affect the individuals inside that house. It rippled outward. Neighbors would later describe waking to sounds they couldn't immediately place. Some thought it was fireworks. Others froze, sensing something was wrong, but unsure what to do. By the time sirens cut through the night, the damage had already been done. The quiet streets were suddenly filled with flashing lights, patrol cars, and the unmistakable presence of emergency responders racing toward a scene they knew would not be simple. Inside the home, the aftermath told a grim story. The kind that doesn't fade when daylight comes. The kind that turns a familiar address into a reference point for tragedy. As news spread, disbelief followed. People struggled to reconcile the violence with the image they had of their neighborhood. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not like this. Not in a place where people waved to each other and assumed safety was a given. But crime does not always announce itself. Sometimes it slips quietly into ordinary spaces, turning routine nights into turning points. And when it does, the effects are lasting. To understand how this night unfolded, we have to go back inside that home. Back to the setting. Back to the moments before everything went wrong. Because the story of this fatal home invasion is not just about what happened during the shootout, but about how quickly normal life can collapse when violence crosses the threshold of the front door. And that story begins with the place where it all happened. The house at the center of this story was not remarkable in any outward way. It was one of many private residences tucked into a Houston neighborhood where familiarity bred comfort. From the outside, it blended in seamlessly. A place people passed without a second glance. A home that carried no hint of the violence it would soon witness. Inside, the space reflected everyday life. Furniture arranged with comfort in mind. Personal belongings scattered in the way they always are when people truly live somewhere. This was not a temporary space or a neglected property. It was a home shaped by routine, habits, and the quiet rhythms of daily existence. The kind of place where people let their guard down because it felt safe. On that night, the occupants were doing what millions of people do every evening. Winding down, talking softly, moving through familiar rooms without thinking about exits or threats. There was no heightened alert, no sense of impending danger. The house existed as it always had, a refuge from the outside world. What makes this detail so important is not the layout or the furnishings, but the mindset of those inside. They believed they were secure, protected by walls, doors, and the assumption that danger belonged elsewhere. There was no reason to think that violence would find them, let alone force its way through their front door. In spaces like this, people are most vulnerable because they are most at ease. Shoes are off, guards are down. Attention is focused inward on rest, conversation, or simple comfort. It is in these moments that the idea of self-defense feels distant and theoretical, not immediate and necessary. The home also represented something deeper. It was a place tied to identity and stability, a private world where life unfolded away from public scrutiny, where laughter, arguments, plans, and memories accumulated over time. Nothing about it suggested it would soon become a crime scene photographed, analyzed, and discussed far beyond its walls. That sense of ordinariness is what makes the violence that followed so unsettling. There was no dramatic buildup inside the home, no warning signs that something catastrophic was approaching. The night progressed as it always did, quietly and predictably. Then, without invitation, that normalcy was interrupted. The invasion didn't just breach a physical structure. It shattered the psychological boundary that separates safety from threat. The moment intruders crossed into the home, the meaning of every room changed. Spaces that once offered comfort became potential points of danger. Corners that had been ignored suddenly mattered. Familiar hallways became places to run, hide, or fight. What unfolded next did not occur in a public place where chaos is expected. It happened in a deeply personal environment, where the expectation of protection is strongest. That contrast between safety and violence is what amplifies the trauma long after the incident ends. To understand the gravity of what happened, it's essential to hold onto this image of the home as it was before the intrusion. Calm, familiar, ordinary, because everything that followed ripped that sense of refuge away. And the speed at which it happened is what makes this case so haunting. There was no prolonged threat outside, no time to prepare, just a sudden transition from routine to survival. The next chapter of this story begins at that exact moment. The moment when the boundary between inside and outside was violently erased. When the home invasion began, the intrusion did not come with warning. There was no prolonged noise outside, no time to process what was happening, no moment to prepare. 1 second, the house existed in its usual state of quiet familiarity. The next, that illusion was violently stripped away. Investigators later pieced together that the suspects entered the home deliberately and with intent. This was not an accidental encounter or a mistaken address. Whether the entry was forced or executed through speed and surprise, the result was the same. Armed intruders crossed into a private space where they did not belong, instantly shifting the balance of power inside the house. The moment of entry was fast and overwhelming. Doors that once symbolized protection became points of vulnerability. The sounds of intrusion cut sharply through the calm, immediately triggering fear and confusion among the occupants. There was no opportunity to hide the reality of what was happening. The presence of weapons made the threat unmistakable and immediate. For the people inside, time seemed to compress. Decisions that normally take minutes were reduced to seconds. The brain shifted from routine thinking to survival mode. Every sound became amplified. Every movement mattered. Fear did not creep in gradually. It arrived fully formed. Armed intrusions are uniquely terrifying because they strip control away instantly. There is no negotiation of safety, no buffer zone. The power dynamic is established the moment weapons are visible. In that instant, the home ceased to be a refuge and became a confined space where escape routes were limited and danger felt unavoidable. Chaos followed quickly. Raised voices, rapid movement, confusion layered over fear. The intruder's presence disrupted every sense of order inside the house. Familiar rooms became unpredictable terrain. The occupants were forced to react without understanding the intruder's intentions, a reality that heightened the danger with every passing second. The shock of the situation cannot be overstated. Home invasions violate not only physical space, but psychological safety. They attack the belief that inside equals safe. That belief shattered the moment the suspects stepped through the door. There was no slow escalation. The threat did not build gradually. It arrived at full force, leaving no room for hesitation. In situations like this, the margin for error is almost non-existent. Fear collides with instinct, and choices are made under extreme pressure. As the confrontation unfolded, it became clear that this was not going to end quietly. The presence of firearms ensured that any mistake, any miscalculation could be fatal. What might have begun with criminal intent escalated rapidly into something far more dangerous. The intrusion marked the point of no return. Once the suspects entered armed, the situation was already spiraling toward violence. The normal rules of everyday life no longer applied. Survival became the only objective. And then, the tension reached its breaking point. The moment gunfire erupted would redefine the night entirely. The home invasion was no longer just an intrusion. It had become a deadly confrontation, one that would leave irreversible consequences in its wake. That moment, when fear gave way to violence, is where this story turns its darkest chapter. The shift from threat to violence happened in an instant. What had already been a terrifying intrusion crossed an irreversible line the moment gunfire erupted inside the home. There was no dramatic buildup, no final warning. Just the sudden, explosive sound of shots fired in close quarters, echoing through rooms never meant to absorb that kind of violence. In confined spaces, gunfire changes everything. Sound becomes disorienting. Vision narrows. The brain struggles to process what is happening while simultaneously trying to survive it. For those inside the house, the eruption of gunfire created immediate confusion. It was difficult to tell where the shots were coming from, who was firing, or how many people were involved. The chaos stripped away any remaining sense of control. What followed was not a single moment, but a rapid sequence of split-second decisions. People moved instinctively, driven by fear and adrenaline rather than deliberate thought. There was no time to assess options calmly, no opportunity to pause. Every movement carried risk. Standing still was dangerous. Running was dangerous. Even hiding carried no guarantee of safety. The confrontation escalated beyond anyone's ability to manage it. Once shots were fired, the situation spiraled. The presence of multiple firearms in an enclosed space ensured that the danger multiplied with each passing second. Bullets do not discriminate. Walls provide little protection. Every direction carried the possibility of fatal consequence. In moments like these, survival depends on circumstances more than planning. Positioning, timing, and chance play decisive roles. People survive not because they chose perfectly, but because they happened to be in the right place at the right moment. Others are not so fortunate. The intensity of the confrontation left no room for heroics or clarity. This was not a controlled exchange. It was confusion layered upon fear. Ray's voices were drowned out by gunshots. The air filled with panic, urgency, and irreversible decisions. Inside the home, the atmosphere transformed completely. Familiar sounds were replaced by deafening blasts. Normal movement became frantic. The idea of safety no longer existed. Only escape, defense, and survival. As the gunfire continued, the reality of the situation became unavoidable. This was no longer a crime that could end without bloodshed. The violence had escalated beyond restraint, fueled by fear, intent, and the presence of lethal weapons. Then, as abruptly as it began, the gunfire stopped. Silence followed, heavy and unnatural, the kind of silence that only comes after chaos. It was in that stillness that the true cost of the confrontation became clear. The damage was done. Lives had been lost. Others had been spared by chance rather than design. The home, once a place of refuge, now bore the marks of violence. The confrontation had left physical evidence that investigators would later examine, but the emotional impact was already permanent. What happened next unfolded not in the heat of violence, but in the cold aftermath. The moments when shock sets in, when reality returns, and when the weight of what just occurred begins to sink in. The shootout was over, but the consequences were just beginning. When the gunfire finally ceased, what remained was not relief, but a heavy, suffocating stillness. In the immediate aftermath of violence, time seems to behave differently. Seconds stretch, breaths feel louder. Minds struggle to comprehend what has just occurred. Inside the Houston home, the chaos gave way to a grim reality that could not be undone. Lives have been lost. The people involved were not statistics or headlines in that moment. They were human beings, each with a past, routines, relationships, and plans that would now never be fulfilled. The violence had cut through those lives without warning, ending them in a place where safety should have been guaranteed. Those who were killed did not die as part of a calculated exchange or distant conflict. They died in close quarters, in confusion, and in fear. Their final moments unfolded in the midst of noise, panic, and uncertainty. There was no time for understanding, no opportunity for goodbyes, just the abrupt finality that violence brings. For the survivors inside the home, the realization came slowly. At first, there was disbelief. People checked themselves for injuries, called out names, tried to make sense of the silence. Then the truth emerged, undeniable and devastating. Someone was not responding. Someone was not moving. The weight of loss settled in with crushing force. Emergency responders would later arrive, trained to handle scenes like this. But for those present in the moments immediately following the shootout, the experience was raw and unfiltered. They stood in rooms now altered forever, surrounded by the aftermath of violence that had stolen lives they could not get back. The human cost of the incident extended far beyond those who were killed. Every life lost created ripples of grief that spread outward. Families would soon receive calls that would shatter their sense of normalcy. Friends would struggle to reconcile memories with sudden absence. Loved ones would replay unanswered questions endlessly, searching for meaning where none could fully exist. There is a particular cruelty to deaths that occur during home invasions. The victims are not in unfamiliar territory. They are not expecting danger. They are in a space associated with comfort, trust, and routine. That betrayal of safety deepens the trauma for everyone involved. This section of the story is not about how many shots were fired or where bullets landed. It is about the lives interrupted and erased. It is about birthdays that will not be celebrated, conversations that will never happen, and futures that vanished in minutes. The neighborhood, too, felt the loss. News of the fatalities spread quickly, replacing whispers with shock. Residents who had gone to sleep expecting an ordinary morning woke up to police presence, flashing lights, and the realization that something irreversible had happened nearby. A shared sense of vulnerability replaced the assumption of safety. In the quiet that followed, grief took hold, not loudly at first, but deeply. The kind of grief that lingers, reshaping how people see their homes, their streets, and their sense of security. The violence had claimed lives, but it had also altered countless others. And as the night transitioned into morning, attention shifted away from the interior of the home and toward the wider response. Law enforcement would now begin piecing together what happened, while the community struggled to come to terms with the loss. The chaos had ended, but its consequences were permanent. The first emergency calls came in almost immediately after the gunfire stopped. Voices on the other end of the line were frantic, overlapping, struggling to explain what had just happened. Dispatchers worked to extract clear details while sending officers racing toward the address. Within minutes, the quiet Houston street filled with flashing lights, sirens cutting through the night, and the unmistakable presence of law enforcement. Officers arrived knowing very little beyond one critical fact. Shots had been fired, and lives were at risk. They approached the home cautiously, weapons drawn, fully aware that the situation might still be active. Scenes like this are unpredictable. A suspect could still be inside. Someone injured might need urgent help. Every step carried risk. The first priority was securing the scene. Officers established a perimeter around the property, ensuring that no one entered or exited without authorization. Neighbors who had stepped outside in confusion were quickly directed back indoors. What had been a residential street moments earlier was now treated as a potential crime zone. Inside the home, officers encountered a scene marked by disorder and urgency. Furniture displaced, signs of struggle, and the unmistakable aftermath of gunfire told them they were dealing with more than a simple break-in. They moved methodically from room to room, clearing spaces and calling out commands, ensuring that no immediate threat remained. Medical assistance was requested and provided as quickly as possible. Officers are trained to administer first aid in critical situations, and they did what they could while awaiting paramedics. In moments like this, there is a painful balance between preserving life and preserving evidence. The priority, always, is human survival, even when the odds are grim. As the scene stabilized, attention turned to identifying and detaining those involved. Individuals found inside the home were separated, questioned, and assessed. Some were in shock. Others were injured. All were treated as part of an active investigation until the facts could be verified. Officers worked to determine who had entered the home unlawfully, who had lived there, and how the confrontation escalated to deadly force. Firearms involved in the incident were located and secured. Each weapon represented a critical piece of the unfolding story. Where it was found, whether it had been fired, and who had access to it would all become key questions in the hours ahead. Nothing was assumed. Everything was documented. Detectives were notified and began arriving as the initial response transitioned into a full-scale investigation. The home was carefully examined, with officers noting shell casings, bullet impacts, and signs of forced or strategic entry. Each detail, no matter how small, had the potential to clarify the sequence of events. Outside, the atmosphere remained tense. Neighbors watched from behind curtains or gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves. Many had lived on the street for years without witnessing anything like this. Seeing police vehicles, crime scene tape, and paramedics in such numbers was unsettling, a stark reminder that violence had breached their sense of normalcy. As the night wore on, law enforcement worked to establish a timeline. Who arrived first? Who called for help? How long did the confrontation last? Officers collected statements while memories were still fresh, knowing that shock and trauma could distort recollections over time. By the time dawn approached, the scene was under control, but the work was far from over. What began as an emergency response had evolved into a complex investigation involving fatalities, potential criminal charges, and unanswered questions. The police had arrived to restore order, but what they uncovered ensured that the story would continue long after the sirens faded. The focus now shifted from immediate danger to accountability, as investigators prepared to determine exactly how and why the night had ended in bloodshed. As the scene transitioned from emergency response to formal investigation, the focus of Houston authorities shifted toward understanding how a quiet night spiraled into lethal violence. The early hours after the shootout were critical. Investigators knew that evidence gathered immediately would shape the direction of the case and determine how the incident would ultimately be understood. Inside the home, detectives began a systematic examination of every room. They documented damage consistent with forced movement through the space, displaced furniture, and areas where the confrontation appeared to intensify. Shell casings were carefully marked and collected, each one logged to determine how many shots were fired and from where. Bullet impacts in walls and household objects helped investigators reconstruct positions and movement during the shootout. This process was slow and deliberate, guided by the need for accuracy rather than speed. Firearms recovered at the scene were secured for forensic testing. Investigators needed to establish which weapons were discharged, who had access to them, and whether the gunfire originated solely from the intruders, the occupants, or both. Ballistic analysis would later play a key role, but even in these early stages, the presence of multiple weapons indicated that the encounter escalated quickly and violently. Statements from individuals involved were taken separately. Officers and detectives understood that shock, fear, and trauma could cloud memory, so interviews were conducted with care. Those inside the home described as sudden intrusion, little time to react, and confusion as events unfolded. Their accounts were compared for consistency, not to assign blame prematurely, but to establish a clear sequence of events. Investigators also looked beyond the interior of the home. Entry points were examined closely. Signs suggested that the invasion was not opportunistic. The manner of entry appeared deliberate, indicating planning rather than chance. This immediately raised questions about motive. Authorities did not publicly speculate, but internally, they began assessing whether the home had been specifically targeted. Background checks were conducted on both the occupants and the intruders. Detectives searched for any prior connections, disputes, or known conflicts that could explain why this particular home was chosen. At the same time, they reviewed recent calls for service in the area, looking for patterns or reports that might offer context. The goal was not to rush to conclusions, but to eliminate uncertainty wherever possible. Neighbors were interviewed to determine whether anything unusual had been observed earlier in the evening. Some recalled unfamiliar vehicles. Others remembered hearing noises that, in hindsight, may have been warning signs. Each detail was recorded, even if its relevance was not immediately clear. Investigations often hinge on small observations that only make sense once the larger picture emerges. As the hours passed, a working theory began to take shape. While still preliminary, authorities leaned toward the conclusion that the incident was targeted rather than random. There was no indication of forced entry for theft alone, and nothing suggested a crime of opportunity. The evidence pointed toward an intentional confrontation, though the full reasons behind it remained under investigation. Importantly, investigators were careful about what they shared publicly. In cases involving fatalities, restraint is essential. Releasing incomplete or speculative information can compromise both the investigation and the legal process that follows. Officials confirmed the basics while emphasizing that the case was active and evolving. By the end of the first day, what was clear was this: the violence was not accidental. It was not the result of a simple misunderstanding. The home invasion had purpose, and uncovering that purpose became the central mission of the investigation. What began as chaos was now being methodically examined, piece by piece. The next phase would move beyond what happened that night, and toward understanding who was responsible and what consequences would follow. As the investigation progressed, attention inevitably turned from what happened to how the law would interpret it. Beneath the shock and grief lay a difficult legal question, one that would shape every decision moving forward. Was the gunfire an act of lawful self-defense, or did it cross the line into criminal violence? In Texas, the law surrounding home invasions and use of force is both firm and complex. The state recognizes the home as a place of heightened protection, where residents are afforded broader rights to defend themselves against unlawful intruders. The principle is rooted in the idea that a person should not be forced to retreat when confronted by danger inside their own home. However, those protections are not unlimited. Each case turns on specific facts, timing, and intent. Investigators had to consider whether the occupants reasonably believed their lives were in immediate danger at the moment shots were fired. This belief does not have to be correct, but it must be reasonable under the circumstances. That determination depends on details that are often contested. Who fired first, whether the intruders were actively threatening lethal force, and whether the danger was ongoing when the confrontation escalated. Complicating matters further was the presence of multiple armed individuals. When gunfire is exchanged rather than one-sided, the legal picture becomes murkier. Authorities needed to establish whether the occupants were responding defensively or whether the situation evolved into a mutual exchange of violence. The law draws a distinction between stopping a threat and continuing force beyond what is necessary to neutralize it. Another key question centered on the intruders themselves. Entering a private residence while armed is a serious criminal offense under Texas law. That fact alone weighs heavily in legal analysis. An armed home invasion creates a presumption of danger, which strengthens claims of self-defense by those inside. Yet even then, investigators must carefully assess whether every action taken during the incident aligns with legal standards. Prosecutors and investigators also examined the possibility of pre-existing connections between the parties involved. If the invasion was tied to prior disputes or criminal activity, that context could influence how the confrontation is interpreted. A targeted invasion connected to ongoing conflict may be viewed differently than a random intrusion, particularly if evidence suggests an expectation of violence on both sides. For families affected by the deaths, the legal uncertainty was deeply unsettling. The absence of immediate charges did not mean innocence, just as the presence of an investigation did not guarantee prosecution. The justice system moves deliberately in cases like this, because the consequences of getting it wrong are profound. A wrongful charge can destroy lives. A failure to prosecute when warranted can undermine public trust. Public reaction added another layer of pressure. Stories involving home invasions often provoke strong opinions, especially in a state where self-defense laws are widely discussed and deeply ingrained in public consciousness. Some saw the incident as a tragic but lawful act of survival. Others questioned whether the level of violence reflected something more than self-protection. Authorities were careful to distance their work from public sentiment, focusing instead on evidence and legal standards. Ultimately, this phase of the case was defined by ambiguity. There were no simple answers, no immediate conclusions that could neatly explain what had unfolded inside the Houston home. Every piece of evidence had to be weighed against the law and every assumption challenged. What was clear, however, was that the outcome would hinge not just on what happened, but on how those moments were interpreted through the lens of Texas law. And as the legal questions deepened, so too did the emotional toll on everyone waiting for answers. Once news of the fatal home invasion and shootout reached the wider Houston neighborhood, the atmosphere shifted from routine calm to a tense, unsettled vigilance. Streets that had seemed quiet and ordinary were suddenly imbued with a new sense of fragility. Neighbors, who had once waved to one another on morning walks or exchanged greetings over fences, now whispered of fear and disbelief. This was not a distant tragedy. It had happened just doors down in a home that had been, until that night, as familiar as their own. For many residents, the idea that a violent, deadly confrontation could erupt in their own neighborhood was difficult to process. There had been no warning signs, no history of crime that suggested this kind of event was likely. Houston, like many communities, relied on the assumption that one's home was a place of sanctuary. That assumption had been violently overturned, and with it, a profound sense of safety evaporated almost instantly. The response varied among neighbors. Some stood at windows and doorways, curious but cautious, trying to piece together what had occurred from the flashing lights and police activity. Others retreated indoors, locking doors and drawing blinds, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion of fear into their daily lives. Community members posted on social media, sharing fragmented information, speculating cautiously, and expressing condolences. Yet alongside the public discussions was a palpable undertone of anxiety. If such violence could occur here, in a private residence, what did that mean for everyone else? Businesses nearby were not immune to the ripple effects. Employees arrived the following morning to a street lined with police tape, cameras, and investigators. Regular customers asked questions, but often left in silence, absorbing the unsettling reality that tragedy could touch ordinary life without notice. The presence of law enforcement, while necessary, was a stark reminder that the neighborhood had shifted. What was once perceived as predictable, safe, and familiar now carried a weight of uncertainty. Community leaders and local authorities were quick to respond publicly, acknowledging residents' fear and promising ongoing updates. Statements emphasized the extraordinary nature of the incident, urging calm while reinforcing that investigations were underway. These reassurances, while important, could not immediately repair the collective sense of violation. Trauma, especially when it touches private space, takes time to reconcile. Families in the surrounding area began to reflect on their own precautions, asking themselves questions that had never seemed necessary before. Are our doors secure? Are our children safe at home? Could something like this happen to us? In that moment, the incident became more than an isolated tragedy. It became a cautionary reminder that safety is never absolute, and the familiar walls of a home do not guarantee protection from the outside, or sometimes even from those with personal knowledge of the household. Grief mingled with unease. Condolences were offered to the victim's family, but even as the community mourned, fear lingered like an unwelcome shadow. People drove more slowly past the home, whispered among themselves in grocery stores and cafes, and tried to process how quickly ordinary life could transform into extraordinary crisis. By widening the lens from the single house to the broader neighborhood, it became clear that the impact of the fatal home invasion was both immediate and lasting. The lives lost inside the home had sent shockwaves outward, touching every resident's perception of safety and trust. In a place where routine had once defined comfort, uncertainty now took root, a stark reminder that no community is immune from sudden, devastating violence. Home is meant to be a sanctuary, a place where one can rest, feel secure, and escape the uncertainties of the world outside. But incidents like the fatal Houston home invasion shatter that fundamental assumption, demonstrating how quickly violence can penetrate even the most private spaces. Unlike crimes that happen on the street or in public areas, home invasions carry an intensified psychological impact because they violate the very place meant to protect. The intersection of criminal intent and personal vulnerability transforms a space of comfort into a site of terror in mere moments. Reflecting on this case, it becomes clear how unpredictable and uncontrollable such situations can be. For the occupants, every second of that night demanded split-second decisions that could mean life or death. The chaos of armed intrusion escalated quickly, leaving little room for rational calculation. What started as a private evening in a familiar home transformed in an instant into a confrontation with irreversible consequences. In such cases, the margin for error is virtually non-existent, and the human cost is immediate and permanent. Beyond the immediate loss of life, home invasions leave long-term scars. Survivors and witnesses often experience profound psychological trauma. The once safe walls of their residence become reminders of danger, shaking their sense of trust in both their environment and, sometimes, the broader world. Families, neighbors, and the community at large carry this weight, feeling both fear and empathy as they try to process the enormity of what happened. The tragedy ripples outward, impacting lives far beyond the home's walls. Moreover, these events highlight a sobering truth about crime. It often intersects with personal relationships, opportunity, and circumstance. Violence does not always appear in predictable forms or locations. It can emerge suddenly, exploiting vulnerability and familiarity to devastating effect. The Houston case underscores that no space, no matter how private or seemingly secure, is completely immune from the consequences of human conflict, criminal intent, or impulsive decisions. As viewers, it is essential to remember that behind every news headline are real people. They are parents, children, friends, and neighbors whose lives are irreversibly altered in an instant. Statistics, reports, and timelines can communicate the facts, but they cannot fully convey the personal devastation, grief, or fear experienced by those directly affected. Every home invasion, every shootout is more than a story. It is a deeply human tragedy. Finally, the case serves as both a warning and a reflection. While we cannot eliminate all risk, awareness of home security, conflict resolution, and vigilance within communities can reduce vulnerabilities. Understanding how quickly ordinary life can turn violent underscores the need for both preparedness and empathy. Violence at the doorstep is a stark reminder of fragility. Safety can be disrupted in moments, and the consequences extend far beyond a single incident. Call to action. If this story has impacted you, take a moment to reflect on safety and awareness in your own life. Subscribe to Real Crime Saga, turn on notifications, and stay with us as we continue to explore the full stories behind headlines, ensuring that no detail, no insight, and no lesson is ever missed. Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments and engage in the conversation, because understanding these tragedies is the first step toward preventing future ones.